Imagine building a continent without cash. From trading beaver pelts for iron tools to fortunes made on shipping empires. How exactly did America's economy begin? We're about to peel back the layers of forgotten transactions and uncover the surprising economic foundations that truly shaped early American society. Hamilton's second major initiative established the Bank of the United States. Chartered in 1791 with 20-year duration and $20 million capital, the federal government subscribed 1/5, private investors the rest in installments of specie and government bonds. The bank issued notes redeemable in coins, providing a uniform currency that circulated nationwide. Branches opened in major ports, facilitating transfers between regions without shipping heavy metal. It served as a government depository managing tax receipts and loan payments efficiently. Critics feared monopoly power, but supporters saw it channeling savings into productive loans for merchants and manufacturers. The bank's substantial building in Philadelphia stood as a quiet symbol of this new order. Marble steps leading to halls where directors met regularly. Notes bearing its seal passed from Boston to Charleston, accepted without question where state paper once fluctuated. Merchants drew bills on branch accounts, settling distant debts swiftly. Government funds moved securely, interest on bonds paid punctually from customs revenue. Private shareholders received steady dividends, encouraging wider investment in national institutions. The bank's disciplined management set standards for later state-chartered competitors. Tariffs formed another pillar, with the 1789 Act imposing moderate duties on imports to fund government operations and protect infant industries. Hamilton's report on manufactures in 1791 advocated higher protective rates for textiles, iron, and glass, arguing that diversity strengthened independence. Though Congress adopted only mild increases, the principle took root. Revenue duty supporting debt service, while encouraging domestic production. Customs houses and ports collected steadily, receipts forming the government's primary income. Officers weighed cargoes carefully. Duties calculated on manifests reviewed in quiet offices. The system operated smoothly, ships clearing wharves with predictable costs. Excise taxes complemented tariffs, notably on distilled spirits in 1791 to diversify revenue. Western farmers protested the burden on their whiskey, leading to disturbances patiently resolved through negotiation and selective enforcement. The episode demonstrated federal authority while teaching restraint and internal taxation. Overall, Hamilton's system created interlocking supports, debt funding generating capital, banknotes providing currency, tariffs supplying revenue. States benefited from assumed debts without further strain, their own credit improved by association. Investors large and small participated, from merchant princes to widows holding bonds. This vision extended beyond finance to infrastructure and growth. Hamilton encouraged societies for useful manufactures, promoting factories in Paterson, New Jersey, and elsewhere. Canals and roads received federal surveys, though funding remained limited. The monetary unit standardized as the dollar, minted in gold and silver at fixed ratios. Coinage flowed gradually from the New Philadelphia Mint, eagles and half dollars bearing Liberty's profile. The system rewarded steady enterprise, merchants planning years ahead with reliable money and credit. Position coalesced around Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, preferring agrarian simplicity and state autonomy. They feared consolidation favored northern commerce over southern planting, speculation over honest labor. Yet Hamilton's plans endured, weathering legal challenges and political shifts. The bank's charter renewal failed in 1811, but its model influenced successors. Debt funding established American credit in European markets, enabling later borrowing for canals and railroads. The unified economy took shape gradually, binding regions through shared institutions. As these foundations settled into place, the nation breathed more easily financially. Bonds traded briskly in coffee houses, notes passed smoothly in markets. The government operated without annual begging from states. Merchants expanded confidently, knowing currency and credit would hold. The quiet machinery of Hamilton's design turned steadily, preparing the ground for continental expansion. We rest here in the orderly world it created, feeling the patient strength of national union. As Hamilton's financial architecture provided the steady foundation for a unified national economy, the gaze of merchants and settlers turned increasingly westward, drawn by reports of vast lands and untapped resources beyond the Appalachians. The Louisiana, purchased in 1803, doubled the nation's territory overnight. Acquired through quiet negotiation for $15 million funded by European loans. Rivers like the Ohio and Mississippi became broad avenues for flatboats carrying families and goods downstream, while trails over mountains saw wagons creaking slowly toward promised fertility. Fur traders led the way, paddling up tributaries in search of beaver streams untouched by earlier harvesting. Land companies formed in eastern cities, pooling capital to buy large tracts from government or indigenous nations, then surveying and selling parcels to migrants. This expansion unfolded patiently season by season, reshaping the continent through persistent movement. Imagine yourself on the banks of the upper Missouri in the 1820s, where a brigade of trappers gathers around evening fires after a day checking lines of steel traps set in icy streams. Mountain men, often employees of the American Fur Company, live seasonally in the Rockies, harvesting prime winter pelts that command high prices in eastern markets. Canoes and pack trains carry the bundled furs back to St. Louis each spring, exchanged for powder, cloth, and coffee to sustain another year. Rendezvous sites in green valleys host annual gatherings where independent trappers meet company agents amid the scent of pine smoke and roasting meat. Indigenous partners Crow, Shoshone, Blackfeet bring additional pelts, negotiating terms in mixed languages honed over repeated visits. The trade sustains remote posts, their log walls sheltering factors who record each skin carefully in ledgers. John Jacob Astor's company dominated this western fur trade, building on his earlier Great Lakes networks to reach the Pacific. Fort Astoria at the Columbia's mouth, established in 1811, marked an early coastal presence, though briefly lost during the War of 1812. Reorganized efforts sent brigades deep into the interior, competing with Hudson's Bay Company posts to the north. Profits flowed steadily eastward, reinvested into Manhattan properties that multiplied in value as the city grew. Astor's quiet oversight from New York directed agents across thousands of miles. Correspondence carried by express riders or river packets the beaver had fashioned in Europe in took a sustained demand, drawing ever more trappers westward until over-harvesting thin streams by the 1840s. Land speculation formed the other great engine, companies purchasing immense tracts at federal auctions or through preemption rights. The Ohio Company of Associates in the 1780s bought millions of acres in the Northwest Territory, surveying townships and reserving sections for schools and veterans. Investors in Philadelphia and Boston subscribed shares, expecting steady appreciation as settlers arrived. Military bounties from the Revolution translated into warrants redeemable for Western land, traded like commodities in Eastern markets. Surveyors worked methodically, running chains through forests to mark rectangular sections that would define future farms. Sales offices in Pittsburgh or Cincinnati offered lots on credit, terms stretching over years to match migrants' gradual payments. Picture a quiet land office in Chillicothe around 1800, where a clerk unrolls plat maps showing neat grids superimposed on river bends and ridges. Families recently arrived from Kentucky or Virginia examine the drawings carefully, choosing parcels near water and timber. Down payments in specie or bonds secure the deed, with annual installments tied to harvest success. Speculators absent from the scene hold larger blocks, waiting for roads and mills to raise values before resale. Newspapers carry advertisements for distant tracts promising fertile soil and navigable streams. the system encourages steady migration, each new settlement increasing surrounding worth. Government policy facilitated this expansion through gradual indigenous cession treaties and public land sales. The Land Ordinance of 1785 established orderly survey before sale, preventing overlapping claims that plagued earlier colonies. Minimum prices dropped over time from $2 per acre to $1.25, while credit terms eased entry for modest farmers. Preemption acts allowed squatters to purchase improvements they made on unsurveyed ground. Canals and roads received federal support. The national road pushing westward from Cumberland to Illinois. Each improvement shortened travel, bringing markets closer and raising land values in quiet increments. Cut and spread provided another powerful driver after the gin's invention, with short staple varieties thriving in upland soils across the Southwest. Planters moved from exhausted seaboard fields to fresh Alabama and Mississippi black lands, carrying enslaved laborers southward in the domestic trade. New Orleans grew as the cotton port, bales stacked high on levees awaiting ships bound for Liverpool or Le Havre. Factors advanced supplies against future crops, their commissions linking local planters to international credit. Wealth from cotton funded further speculation, purchasing public lands for new plantations. Crops profitability justified removal policies that opened indigenous territories to settlement, for trade paths often preceded agricultural settlement. Trappers' reports guiding immigrants toward fertile valleys. Lewis and Clark's expedition, funded publicly, returned with maps and specimens that fueled imagination and investment. Oregon Trail ruts deepened year by year, as wagon trains followed mountain men's routes to the Pacific. Mormon migrants organized methodically to Utah, California. Gold seekers rushed overland after 1848. Each wave built towns and roads, infrastructure that supported the next. Railroads later followed these corridors, but early expansion relied on rivers, trails, and patient endurance. Indigenous nations faced steady pressure as trade shifted from partnership to displacement. Treaties exchanged annuities for vast cessions, councils deliberating gravely under government commissioners' patient persuasion. Removal acts in the 1830s enforced relocations westward, opening southeastern lands to cotton and speculation. Resistance persisted in places: Seminole Wars in Florida, Sauk and Fox in Illinois, but military superiority and demographic tide prevailed gradually. Continent's economic integration came at profound human cost, lives disrupted to clear space for new enterprises. By mid-century, these drivers for cotton land had carried settlement to the Pacific, claims extending from sea to sea. Telegraph lines and Pony Express linked distant outposts. Commerce flowing faster across the widened nation. Ports like San Francisco rose swiftly on gold and wheat, connecting to the eastern capital through Panama or Cape Horn routes. The economic underpinnings stretched thin but held, supporting manifest destiny's quiet fulfillment. A continental market emerged, raw materials moving eastward, manufactured goods and migrants westward in steady exchange. As trails lengthened and settlements multiplied, the nation's economic center shifted gradually inland. Chicago grew from fur post to rail hub, processing western grain and livestock for eastern tables. The patterns established in colonial trade, resource extraction, speculative investment, labor mobilization scaled to continental dimensions. Wealth concentrated in new cities, funding libraries, universities, and philanthropies that bore speculators' names. The expansion's rhythm remained unhurried in individual lives, yet relentless across generations. We linger here at the edge of this vast interior, sensing the patient accumulation that turned wilderness into an interconnected empire. Rivers carry boats downstream heavy with produce. Trails echo with the wagon wheels turning westward, the economic threads we have followed from. Indigenous paths to national finance now span a continent, binding distant regions in shared prosperity and possibility. And now, dear listener, as our journey across these centuries of exchange draws gently to its close, Allow yourself to settle deeper into the quiet comfort of the present. We have traveled together from ancient trade trails winding through forests and rivers, through the patient barters of early encounters, to the vast mercantile systems that shaped a nation and a continent. Lives poured effort into fields and voyages, building wealth through seasons of toil and waiting. Their stories woven into the fabric of the land we know today. So much has changed the rhythm of commerce, now swift and digital. Yet the patient human impulse to connect, trade, and build remains. Here in this moment, far removed from those distant struggles and ambitions, you rest safely, warmly, with nothing demanded of you but the gentle drift toward sleep. Let these echoes of the past fade softly, carrying you into deep, restorative night. Good night. Private merchant banking dominated in major ports, where great houses like the Browns in Providence or the Hancocks in Boston managed deposits and loans. Clients deposited species or commodities, receiving book credits transferable by check or note. Overseas correspondents in London or Amsterdam honored drafts, creating chains of credit across the Atlantic. Interest rates reflected risks higher for distant voyages, lower for local trade. Insurance is often bundled with loans, protecting against shipwreck or capture. These arrangements allowed merchants to operate with minimal actual coin, multiplying effective capital. Bills of exchange became essential instruments, drawn by colonial exporters on British importers after goods were delivered. Virginia planters shipped tobacco, receiving a bill payable in 90 days at a London house. This bill circulated locally, endorsed from hand to hand, serving as money until maturity. Discounts applied when cashed early, creating a quiet market in paper. Factors specialized in negotiating these instruments, charging fees while advancing funds. The system relied on trust in signatures and ultimate payment overseas. Promissory notes filled smaller gaps, simple promises to pay a sum on demand or at a date. Peasants issued them for tools purchased, farmers for seed or livestock. Courts enforced collection, though delays were common in distant settlements. Compound interest accrued on overdue amounts, encouraging timely settlement. Women sometimes signed as executors or in their own right, managing family credits. The notes passed informally, endorsed on the back like modern checks. Lotteries served as another financial tool, authorized by assemblies to fund public works like roads or colleges. Tickets sold widely, promising large prizes from pooled subscriptions. Harvard and Yale benefited early, while Pennsylvania raised funds for batteries and hospitals. Risk spread across many buyers, each dreaming quietly of sudden wealth. Drawings occurred publicly, numbers called amid gathered crowds. Though gambling in nature, lotteries channeled savings into communal projects. Marine insurance developed alongside banking, with underwriters gathering in coffee houses to share voyage risks. Policies covered hull, cargo, or both, premiums calculated by route and season. Lloyd's of London conflicts, yet also spurred thought about independent financial systems. Post-war proposals circulated for colonial banks on the British model, with charters granting no issuing privileges. Philadelphia Merchants Plan one in 1780. Though delayed by war, New York and Boston followed similar discussions. The ideas took root during the Revolution, when continental currency and loan certificates tested public faith in paper. Experiences with depreciation taught caution, shaping stricter banking later. These early instruments and institutions created a more formal framework. Wealth moved abstractly through signatures and seals. Merchants tracked balances in double entry books. Taught to apprentices over years, clerks copied letters and bills in neat hands, preserving records against disputes. Vaults in brick buildings guarded specie and documents alike. The quiet evolution prepared America for the national banking that would follow independence. As evening deepens in these counting houses, lamps cast steady glows on ledgers closing for the day. Partners lock drawers, satisfied with balances that promise continuation tomorrow. The machinery of finance turns patiently, underpinning the mercantile world we have traversed. Feel this orderly structure settling around. transforming personal trust into systemic reliability. As banks and bills of exchange brought greater order to colonial commerce, a quieter discontent began to spread through port cities and rural assemblies alike. British victories in the 7 Years' War had removed French threats from North America but left London burdened with heavy debts and the cost of maintaining frontier garrisons. Parliament turned to the prosperous colonies for revenue, proposing measures that would extract funds directly rather than through customary trade duties. Colonists, long accustomed to managing their own taxes through elected assemblies, viewed these new impositions as intrusions on hard-won privileges. Merchants and planters, whose fortunes depended on fluid credit and open markets, felt the constraints most acutely. The grievances accumulated slowly, expressed first in petitions and pamphlets before hardening into resistance. Imagine yourself in a Boston tavern in 1765. The room warmed by a modest fire as merchants and artisans discussed the latest news from London, over mugs of flip, word has arrived of the Stamp Act requiring revenue stamps on newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. Every transaction, from a ship's bill of lading to a tavern license, would now carry this direct tax payable in scarce specie. Printers calculate the added costs quietly, knowing subscriptions might fall if prices rise. Lawyers and clerks foresee delays in courts as clients hesitate over stamped paper. The act touches daily life in subtle but persistent ways, reminding everyone of Parliament's distant authority. The response unfolded patiently across ports. Sons of Liberty gathered in tree-shaded squares, organizing boycotts of British goods to pressure merchants back home. Homespun cloth appeared more often, a quiet statement of self-reliance. Assemblies passed resolutions asserting that taxation without representation violated ancient rights. Stamp distributors faced polite but firm resignations, leaving the act unenforceable in many places. When it was repealed in 1766 amid British merchant complaints, celebrations were measured, for the accompanying declaratory act claimed Parliament's full power to legislate for colonies in all cases whatsoever. Further measures followed in 1767 with the Townshend Acts placing duties on imported glass, paint, paper, and tea items essential to daily commerce and comfort. The revenue would fund colonial governors and judges independently of assemblies, reducing local leverage. Merchants renewed non-importation agreements. Warehouses filled with unsold stock as ships returned empty from England. Women managed household economies with greater care, substituting local herbs for imported tea. Artisans found new markets for American-made goods, from nails to furniture. The boycotts worked gradually, British exports falling sharply until partial repeal in 1770 left only the tea duty intact. As a symbol of principle, tension simmered in quiet ways until the Tea Act of 1773 granted the East India Company a monopoly on colonial sales, undercutting smugglers and local merchants alike. Company's surplus tea would sell cheaply but still carry the hated duty, reinforcing Parliament's right to tax. Consignees in ports faced pressure to resign, while assemblies debated responses in measured tones. In Boston, Samuel Adams and others organized opposition that culminated in the quiet destruction of tea. Cargoes under moonlight, disguised figures boarded ships methodically, chests opened and contents poured overboard without damage to vessels or crews. The act was deliberate, symbolic, and carefully contained. Parliament responded with the course of acts in 1774, closing Boston's port until restitution, altering Massachusetts' charter and quartering troops in private homes. Colonists saw these as punishments on an entire province for the actions of a few, eroding traditional liberties. Merchants watched wharves fall silent, ships idle at anchor while livelihoods dwindled. Assemblies sent delegates to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, coordinating broader non-importation and preparing petitions. The measures affected everyone indirectly: higher prices for scarce goods, delayed credit from London houses nervous about repayment. Economic life slowed, forcing reflection on dependence. These disputes revealed deeper structural grievances. Navigation acts confined trade to British ships and markets, often at lower prices than foreign buyers offered. Molasses duties, even when evaded, raised from costs for northern distilleries. Restrictions on manufacturing ironworks limited to raw pig. Hats and woolens prohibited from intercolonial sales stifled diversification. Colonial money issues were curtailed, leaving species drained outward to pay trade imbalances. Assemblies lost control over governors. Salaries weakening checks on executive power. Each policy intended to strengthen the empire instead highlighted asymmetries that merchants and planters felt daily. Southern planters bore heavy debts to British factors, mortgages on enslaved labor and land securing advances for next season's crop. Falling tobacco prices after the war squeezed margins, making new taxes particularly burdensome. Northern merchants relied on West Indies trade often conducted illicitly with French or Dutch islands to balance accounts. Both groups saw imperial reforms as threats to the patient systems they had built. Pamphlets like John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania explained these connections calmly, reaching readers across regions. Committees of correspondence shared news and strategies, knitting colonies into shared purpose. The economic boycotts proved remarkably effective, women and families sustaining them through domestic production. Spinning bees gathered in parlors, wheels humming as yarn accumulated for homespun clothing. Local markets flourished with American goods from shoes to pottery. The discipline required patience, no imported luxuries, delayed fashions, careful inventories. Yet participation built quiet solidarity, ordinary people feeling their choices mattered. British merchants facing empty order books petitioned Parliament for relief, revealing colonial leverage. When Lexington and Concord erupted in 1775, economic grievances had already prepared minds for separation. Armories stocked through smuggled powder, committees organized supplies. The Second Continental Congress managed war finance through paper emissions and foreign loans. Testing ideas of independent economy, trade shifted gradually to neutral or French ports, bypassing British restrictions. The conflict's costs would prove immense, but the underlying disputes over revenue and regulation had made compromise elusive. As these measures and responses unfolded, the colonial economy built on barter crops and transatlantic ties faced its greatest disruption. Merchants closed ledgers with uncertain balances. Planters harvested under looming conflict, yet the shared experience of resistance forged new possibilities. We pause here amid these gathering tensions, feeling the slow shift from grievance to resolve, as the grievances of trade restrictions and taxation hardened into resolve. The new nation emerged from the war with fragmented economies and war-weary finances. States issued their own currencies, often depreciating rapidly as presses ran to pay troops and suppliers. Debts lingered from continental loans and requisitions, creditors waiting patiently for repayment that seemed distant. Interstate tariffs hampered commerce, to New Jersey merchants paying duties to cross into New York or Pennsylvania. Articles of Confederation left Congress powerless to regulate trade or raise revenue directly, depending on voluntary state contributions that arrived irregularly. Leaders gathered in Philadelphia in 1787, quietly determined to create a stronger framework that could bind the states economically as well as politically. Imagine yourself in the warm assembly room of the Constitutional Convention, sunlight filtering through high windows as delegates debate the Commerce Clause. With measured voices, James Madison and others argued patiently for federal power to regulate interstate and foreign trade, preventing the jealousies that had weakened the Confederation. Alexander Hamilton, though not a delegate, influenced discussions through letters and conversations, envisioning a national economy that could rival European powers. The resulting Constitution granted Congress authority over tariffs, coinage, and bankruptcy laws, creating uniform rules for a continental market. States surrendered their emission of money and imposed duties, pooling sovereignty for shared prosperity. The document's ratification unfolded slowly across hot summers, with promises of amendments easing fears of central overreach. Once ratified, the new government turned immediately to financial stability under George Washington's steady leadership. Alexander Hamilton, appointed Treasury Secretary in 1789, presented a series of reports that outlined a comprehensive vision for national credit and growth. His first focus is on public debt, federal and state obligations from the war amounting to millions, held by domestic merchants and foreign lenders. Hamilton proposed full assumption of state debts by the federal government, funded through new bonds bearing interest. Creditors would exchange old certificates for new ones payable reliably, establishing American credit abroad. The plan passed after quiet compromises, including location of the capital on the Potomac to satisfy Southern interests. Picture a New York counting house in 1790, where merchants examine Hamilton's report on public credit spread across a polished table. The document argued calmly that funded debt, if managed properly, became a blessing rather than a burden, circulating as capital for commerce. Bonds traded actively on emerging exchanges, their prices rising as investors gained confidence. Speculators purchased old certificates cheaply from veterans, profiting when exchanged at par. Foreign capital flowed in from Dutch houses, attracted by guaranteed interest paid in specie. The system rewarded patience, turning wartime sacrifice into enduring national strength. In the Americas, smaller joint stock ventures proliferated for specific trades. The Royal African Company, chartered in 1672, pooled funds to supply enslaved laborers to English plantations, building forts along the Guinea coast. Investors included royal family members and London merchants, shares promising dividends from the grim but profitable traffic. Bermuda and Providence Island companies attempted plantation colonies in the Caribbean, funding settlers and defenses against Spanish claims. Many failed quietly, losses absorbed across shareholders rather than bankrupting individuals. The model's flexibility allowed experimentation across oceans and commodities. Back in England, the Hudson's Bay Company received its charter in 1670, granting vast northern territories for fur trade. Prince Rupert and fellow adventurers raised initial stock to outfit ships, probing the bay's icy waters. Permanent capital supported wintering posts where factors traded with indigenous hunters. Year after year, beaver pelts returned in steady volumes, dividends flowing to shareholders who never saw the distant factories. Shares traded publicly, rising with successful voyages and falling on news of French raids. Companies' entrance demonstrated how joint stock permanence suited remote, seasonal commerce. Colonial merchants adopted variations for local needs. Boston and Philadelphia traders formed temporary associations to fund privateering during wars, shares entitling owners to portions of captured prizes. West India partnerships pooled resources for sugar voyages, ensuring against hurricanes or pirates. Larger undertakings like whaling fleets from Nantucket divided ownership among captains, crew, and investors. Shares in a whale ship might belong to dozens of people, from the widow who inherited them to the blacksmith who took payment in kind. Returns came as barrels of oil and bone sold in port to distill into lamp fuel or fashion into stays. This pooling transformed what was possible in early American business. A single merchant could now participate in multiple ventures, shares in a Virginia tobacco ship, a Newfoundland fishing voyage, and a Caribbean sugar run, diversifying risk across seasons and markets. Capital accumulated gradually in growing ports, funding larger vessels and longer journeys. Women often held shares inherited from husbands, managing investments through agents while maintaining households. Young apprentices dreamed of earning enough to buy into the next subscription list. The system rewarded patience, as profits might take years to materialize. Even failures taught lessons absorbed collectively. When a joint stock colony like Popham in Maine collapsed after one winter, investors lost their stakes but preserved other assets. Promoters refined charters, adding clauses for governance and land distribution. Successes like Virginia's tobacco boom after 1616 validated the approach, drawing fresh subscriptions. The quiet spread of joint stock organization laid foundations for the mercantile empires to come. As we rest here amid these gathering investments, feel the patient assembly of resources that would soon consolidate into greater fortunes. As joint stock companies gathered distant investors into shared ventures, certain families emerged who turned these opportunities into enduring personal dynasties. Weaving commerce with influence across generations, these merchant houses began modestly, often with ascension and risk assessment from fathers who had navigated Atlantic uncertainties. Daughters married into allied families, linking ledgers and warehouses across ports. Wealth accumulated not in sudden windfalls, but in the steady compounding of returns from furs, sugar, flour, and land. Over time, these clans shaped not only markets but also politics, their voices carrying weight in assemblies and councils. Imagine yourself in a substantial New York townhouse in the mid-1700s. The parlor warmed by a low fire as members of the Livingston family review accounts, spread across a mahogany table. For Livingston, the first lord of the manor, had arrived from Scotland decades earlier, securing vast Hudson Valley lands through patents and shrewd dealings. His descendants traded flour milled from tenant farms, shipping it southward to feed Caribbean plantations while importing rum and molasses in return. Warehouses along the riverfront bore the family name, filled with barrels awaiting favorable markets. Political offices followed naturally: governorships, assembly seats, judgeships, where decisions on trade regulations often aligned with family interests. The manor house at Claremont stood as a quiet center of this network, hosting allies who arrived by sloop for extended visits. Further downriver, the Phillips family built similar influence through milling and transatlantic shipping, their Yankers estate overseeing vast tenant farms. Frederick Phillips traded with pirates when it suited, accepting prize goods in exchange for provisions, then laundered the profits into legitimate commerce. His heirs expanded into the slave trade and privateering, fortunes growing amid the uncertainties of war. Land grants rewarded loyalty to the crown, creating estates that produced wheat for export while employing enslaved laborers in fields and mills. Political appointments ensured favorable tax assessments and trade privileges. The family's reach extended into New York's Common Council, shaping port regulations to benefit their wharves. In Philadelphia, the Logan and Pemberton families combined Quaker restraint with commercial acumen, trading in furs, wheat, and iron. James Logan, secretary to William Penn, used insider knowledge to acquire prime lands, then developed them into profitable farms, shipping produce overseas. His library, one of the colony's finest, reflected the cultured side of merchant wealth. The books arrived alongside cloth and hardware. Descendants maintained ties to London Quaker merchants, securing credit on favorable terms. Political roles in the proprietary government allowed quiet influence over land policy and Indian trade regulations. Their homes hosted traveling ministers and traders alike, blending faith with business in measured conversation. The Hancock family of Boston rose through shipping and smuggling, John Hancock's uncle Thomas building a fleet that evaded navigation acts with practiced ease. House on Beacon Hill overlooked the harbor where their vessels loaded fish and unloaded tea, until the famous protest that bore the younger John's name. Wealth funded political activity, with John signing the Declaration boldly, his fortune backing continental loans during the Revolution. Earlier generations had traded with the West Indies, returning with sugar that fed local distilleries. Enslaved servants managed households, their labor supporting the family's public life. The name became synonymous with both commerce and independence. Later, after independence, John Jacob Astor arrived from Germany with little more than musical instruments to sell, yet built an empire first in furs and then in Manhattan real estate. His American Fur Company dominated Western trade, establishing posts from the Great Lakes to the Pacific through partnerships and relentless competition. Agents paddled deep into the interior, exchanging goods for pelts that filled New York warehouses. Profits reinvested into city lots purchased cheaply from farmers, held patiently until population growth multiplied values. Astor's quiet negotiations with government officials secured advantageous terms for Western ventures. His fortune, vast by the 1830s, funded libraries and hotels that bore his name. The Livingston clan continued post-revolution influence with Robert R. Livingston negotiating the Louisiana Purchase while investing in steamboats alongside Robert Fulton. Their Claremont estate witnessed early trials of the North River steamboat, smoke rising gently over the Hudson as the vessel proved commercial viability. Family members served as chancellors, senators, and ministers to France, their commercial interests aligning with national expansion. Land holdings grew through speculation in western territories opened by the purchase. Political connections ensured favorable charters for canals and banks. The name appeared on treaties and inventions alike. These families often intermarried, creating dense webs of obligation and shared interest. The Livingston might wed a Schuylkill or Beekman heir, combining Hudson flour with New York shipping. Berries included shares in vessels or warehouse space, strengthening alliances. Children educated in Europe returned with refined tastes and useful contacts in London counting houses. Enslaved labor in households and rural estates freed family members for oversight of distant ventures. Wealth displayed quietly fine silver, imported wallpapers, landscape gardens rather than ostentatiously. Political power flowed naturally from economic strength. Merchant families dominated colonial assemblies, drafting laws that protected trade routes or lowered duties on their staples. Governorships and council seats rewarded loyalty while providing leverage over appointments and contracts. During tensions with Britain, some remained loyalists, protecting assets through London ties, while others embraced independence to reshape policy. Post-war constitutions often bore their influence, balancing property qualifications with broader suffrage. Their homes became venues for quiet negotiation, where disputes were resolved over port and Madeira. Yet this consolidation carried quieter costs. Smaller traders found markets dominated by established houses offering better credit terms. Indigenous nations faced intensified pressure as family-backed companies expanded fur frontiers. Enslaved people built the infrastructure, wharves, mills, mansions that supported dynastic wealth, their lives measured against ledgers. Tenants on vast manors paid rents in grain, binding them to family mills and stores. Competition sometimes turned ruthless, undercutting rivals or lobbying for exclusive charters. Through patient generations, these families transformed commerce into something hereditary, passing not just fortunes but networks and knowledge. Sons learned to read market reports by candlelight. Daughters managed households that doubled as business centers. Estates along rivers and bays served as quiet command posts for transatlantic empires. Their influence lingered in street names, institutions, and land titles long after individual names faded. As we linger here in the warm glow of these merchant parlors, feel the slow weaving of wealth and power across decades and oceans. As merchant families consolidated their quiet empires through trade and kinship, the growing complexity of commerce called for institutions that could safeguard wealth and extend credit beyond personal networks. Early banks emerged slowly in the colonies, often as private enterprises or land banks proposed by assemblies to ease the chronic shortage of species. These institutions issued paper notes backed by land mortgages or future taxes. circulating as a more convenient medium than bulky commodities. Depositors entrusted coins or goods for safekeeping, receiving interest or the ability to draw bills on account. Lenders advanced funds against collateral, fueling expansion of plantations, ships, and warehouses. The development marked a shift toward abstract finance. Value moved on paper rather than in barrels or pelts. Imagine yourself in a modest Philadelphia counting house in the 1720s, where Quaker merchants gathered to discuss forming a private bank among trusted partners. Ledgers record deposits of Spanish dollars and English guineas, rare coins carefully weighed and locked in iron chests. Notes issued against these reserves passed between traders, redeemable on demand for species or goods. Borrowers pledged land deeds or ship cargoes as security, receiving funds to outfit voyages or purchase enslaved laborers. The room smells faintly of ink and sealing wax, as partners sign agreements with measured deliberation. This informal banking sustains growth without royal charters, relying on reputation and mutual oversight. Public efforts appeared earlier in New England, where land banks proposed issuing notes secured by mortgaged farms. Massachusetts experimented in the 1710s and again in 1740, allowing landowners to borrow paper money against property values. Notes circulated widely for daily transactions, easing the dearth of coins that hampered trade. Assembly supported these schemes to stimulate the economy after lean years, but British merchants complained of depreciation and pressured Parliament to suppress them. Currency Act of 1751 restricted new emissions in New England, extended later to all colonies, yet the experiments demonstrated demand for flexible money, preparing minds for post-war innovations. In South Carolina, the 1730s saw public loans funded by duties on imports, notes issued to planters against future rice crops. These circulated alongside private merchant bills accepted in local markets and taverns. Charleston factors advanced credit on similar terms, drawing bills on London correspondence payable after shipments sold. The system bridged seasonal gaps, funds available in spring for planting, repaid after autumn harvest. Risks accumulated quietly when crops failed or prices fell, leaving debts lingering across years. Still, the paper facilitated larger plantations and more ships calling at the harbor. In the Caribbean, sugar islands like Barbados and Jamaica served as primary destinations, their intense plantations requiring constant replenishment due to harsh conditions and high mortality. Mainland colonies received fewer direct shipments after the early 1700s, relying more on internal trade from island intrepids or older seaboard states. Charleston and Savannah grew as entry points for Carolina planters, while Virginia buyers sometimes traveled south to select workers. The overall flow reshaped demographics, the African-descended populations becoming majorities in many plantation zones. Cultural blends emerged, Gullah dialects along the coast, new foodways incorporating African crops like okra and peas. Northern colonies benefited indirectly, their merchants and ship captains profiting without hosting large plantations. Boston's distilleries ran continuously, Newport became a rum capital, and Philadelphia outfitters supplied barrels and provisions. Seafaring communities developed around the trade, with sailors' wages spent in taverns and shops. Insurance offices calculated risks for voyages, pooling capital to cover losses from storms or uprisings. The wealth trickled through economies, funding churches, schools, and public buildings that gave ports a prosperous air. British regulations encouraged this system by allowing colonial ships to participate, while taxing foreign competitors. Molasses Act duties aimed to favor the British West Indies, but were widely evaded through smuggling with French islands. Parliament's oversight remained light enough for the trade to flourish, enriching both sides of the Atlantic. Merchants formed partnerships across ports, sharing risks and information via regular packet ships. Letters detailed market conditions, who needed labor, where crops fetched best prices, guiding next departures. Yet the horrifying efficiency carried profound consequences beyond ledgers. Generations lived in bondage, their labor extracted without compensation, building infrastructure and wealth that endured long after. Communities formed resilient cultures, preserving music, stories, and spiritual practices amid hardship. Demographic shifts altered societies permanently, with implications reaching into independence and beyond. The Triangle's profits funded much of colonial growth, from grand homes to expanding trade networks. As we pause here in the steady motion of these voyages, sense the vast distances crossed and the quiet accumulation of change they brought, as the triangular routes carried goods and people across vast oceans, feeding the plantations that sustained colonial growth. Certain coastal settlements began to transform into bustling yet orderly ports. Boston, perched on a fine natural harbor in Massachusetts Bay, emerged early as a center for shipbuilding and trade. Narrow streets wound between brick warehouses and modest homes, where merchants tracked rivals in quiet counting houses. Wharves extended into the water, lined with vessels unloading Caribbean sugar or loading New England timber and fish. The air carried salt mingled with pine tar from nearby yards, where skilled carpenters shaped hulls from local oak. Trade here diversified steadily, connecting northern farms to distant markets without relying on a single crop. Imagine yourself strolling Boston's Long Wharf in the mid-1700s. The wooden planks creaking softly underfoot as dock workers rolled barrels toward waiting carts. Ships from London tie up alongside smaller sloops from Rhode Island, their holds filled with English cloth, hardware, and tea. Factors negotiate calmly with captains, agreeing on prices for codfish packed in salt or potash from inland clearings. Taverns nearby offer warm rum and news from recent packets, where merchants gather to share letters from overseas partners. Roadblocks stretch long and straight, workers twisting hemp into coils that will rig the next fleet. The harbor bustles without haste, each vessel finding its place in the steady rhythm of loading and unloading. Further south, New York, once New Amsterdam, grew at the mouth of the Hudson River, its deep waters welcoming larger ships than many rivals. Dutch influences lingered in gabled houses and street names, blending gradually with English customs after the 1664 takeover. Port handled flour and wheat from fertile upstate farms, shipped downriver on flatboats and sloops. Merchants exported these provisions to the West Indies, returning with sugar and molasses for northern distilleries. Warehouses along the East River stored diverse cargoes, furs from the interior, timber from New Jersey pines, and imported luxuries for local shops. The city's position fostered connections northward to Albany fur posts and southward along the coast. Picture a quiet morning on New York's docks, fog lifting slowly to reveal masts rising like a forest against the skyline. Bakers' ovens send the scent of fresh bread wafting towards sailors securing lines after long voyages. Carts rumble over cobblestones, carrying barrels of pork and beef bound for Caribbean plantations. Coffee houses serve as informal exchanges, where traders sip hot drinks while discussing crop reports and insurance rates. Slave auctions occurred periodically on the wharves, lives changing hands amid the routine commerce. The city's own enslaved population remained smaller than in southern ports. Markets offered fresh produce from Long Island farms, sustaining the growing population of artisans and laborers. Charleston in South Carolina developed later but rose swiftly on the strength of rice and indigo exports from surrounding plantations. Its harbor, protected by barrier islands, allowed safe anchorage for deep draft ships crossing directly from England. Broad streets laid out in orderly fashion led to substantial homes built by prosperous planters and merchants. The port handled immense quantities of rice barrels and indigo cakes, inspected carefully before loading. Deerskins from interior trade added variety carried down by Native American and European traders. The city's wealth showed in its churches, theaters, and fine gardens. Funded by the steady flow of plantation produce, stand for a moment on Charleston's Bay Street as evening approaches. The warm air thick with the scent of jasmine from nearby planters' townhouses. Vessels rock gently at anchor, their crews singing softly while mending nets or preparing for departure. Factors in linen suits oversee gangs loading rice hogsheads onto lighters that ferry them to larger ships offshore. Taverns echo with low conversations and English accents mingled with gullah phrases from dock workers. Markets close for the day, leaving stalls fragrant with peaches and okra from low country gardens. Port's rhythm matches the tidal rise and fall, goods moving out with each favorable wind. These ports shared common patterns of growth, their wharves extending farther into harbors as trade volumes increased. Shipyards in all three cities built sturdy vessels suited to Atlantic crossings, employing caulkers, blacksmiths, and sailmakers in steady work. Merchants formed partnerships, pooling capital to outfit voyages and share risks from storms or market shifts. Insurance developed informally at first, with underwriters gathering in coffee houses to sign policies covering hulls and cargo. Banks emerged slowly, providing credit against future shipments. Peasants flourished, coopers making barrels, chandlers supplying candles and oil, printers producing bills of lading. Daily life in these cities revolved around the harbor's cadence. Bells marked ship arrivals, drawing crowds to wharves for news and goods. Women managed household accounts, purchasing imported cloth or tea with proceeds from local sales. Children learned trades in workshops overlooking the water, listening to stories of distant ports. Enslaved laborers performed much of the heavy dock work, rolling barrels, loading bales, their efforts essential to the port's efficiency. Free black communities formed gradually, working as pilots, fishermen, or skilled tradespeople. Immigrants arrived steadily, Scots in Charleston, Germans via New York, adding to the diverse hum of accents. Intercolonial trade bound the ports together. The coastal packets carrying flour from New York to Charleston or rum from Boston southward. Smuggling thrived in hidden coves, evading duties on molasses or European goods. Privateers during wars brought prizes into harbor, injecting sudden wealth through auctions. Fires occasionally swept wooden districts, prompting rebuilding with break and better planning. Newspapers printed shipping news, helping merchants track vessels and prices. Ports became cultural centers, hosting theaters, libraries, and scientific lectures funded by commerce. Social hierarchies reflected economic roles. Great merchants lived in substantial homes with imported furnishings, entertaining visiting captains and factors. Middling traders and shopkeepers occupied smaller houses, their livelihoods tied to retail and coastal runs. Laborers and sailors crowded boarding houses near the docks, spending wages quickly in taverns. Planters maintained town residences for the social season, overseeing shipments personally. Wealth concentrated gradually, creating families whose names endured across generations. As night falls over these harbors, lanterns glow softly on masts and along wharves, guiding late workers home. The gentle lap of water against pilings mingles with distant calls of watchmen. Ships ride at anchor, waiting for morning tides to carry them onward. These ports, grown from modest beginnings, now linked continents through their quiet, persistent activity. Feel the steady pulse of this maritime world settling around you, connecting distant fields and forests to the wider ocean. As port cities hummed with the steady activity of ships and warehouses, ambitious merchants began to organize capital in new ways, sharing risks across many investors rather than bearing them alone. Joint stock companies emerged gradually in England during the late 1500s and early 1600s. Inspired by earlier Italian and Dutch models that divided ownership into transferable shares. Investors purchased portions of a venture, contributing funds that financed ships, crews, and cargoes for distant trades. Profits, when they came after long delays, were distributed according to shares held, while losses were limited to the initial investment. This structure allowed ordinary merchants, gentry, and even widows to participate in overseas commerce without risking total ruin. Approach spread quietly, enabling ventures to costly for any single fortune. Imagine yourself in a London coffee house around 1600. The air warm with tobacco smoke and the low murmur of conversation as men in wool coats discuss the latest subscription list. Promoter unrolls documents for the Muscovy company already established for Russian trade, inviting new shareholders to fund additional ships. Quills scratch on parchment as investors sign for shares worth 10 or 20 pounds each. Modest sums that together outfit a vessel bound for Archangel. Later gatherings celebrate returns, bales of fur and timber unloaded after months at sea. The dividends paid in coin or goods. Company persists across voyages, its stock traded informally among members. This permanence distinguishes it from earlier single voyage partnerships that dissolved after each return. The Virginia Company of London, chartered in 1606, applied the model on a grander scale to colonize North America. Hundreds of investors, nobles, merchants, craftsmen pooled thousands of pounds to send settlers and supplies across the Atlantic. Shares promised not only profits from tobacco and other commodities, but also land grants in the new territory. Early years brought heavy losses as Jamestown struggled, yet the joint stock structure kept resources flowing through multiple expeditions. Adventurers in England received reports by returning ships debating strategy in courtly assemblies. When private plantations proved more profitable, the company dissolved in 1624, its model already proven for sustained overseas effort. Further north, the Plymouth Company attempted a similar settlement in New England, though with less immediate success. Investors funded the Mayflower voyage in 1620 as part of a joint stock patent, expecting returns from fishing, furs, and trade. The Pilgrim's patent merged with later Massachusetts Bay efforts, where shares supported migration and town building. Dividends came slowly, often in land or future trade privileges, yet the pooled capital enabled communities to establish themselves amid harsh winters. Shareholders back home waited patiently for news carried by annual supply ships. The structure bridged vast distances, linking English parlors to frontier clearings. Dutch merchants refined the model dramatically with the United East India Company in 1602, raising permanent capital that never returned to investors except as dividends. The VOC issued shares traded on Amsterdam's exchange, allowing prices to fluctuate with news of spice cargoes or Asian factories. This liquidity drew wider participation from wealthy regions to modest burghers investing savings. Armed ships protected routes, establishing fortified posts from Indonesia to Japan. English rivals soon imitated the permanence, forming the English East India Company in 1600 with similar lasting capital. Both giants dominated Asian trade for centuries, their success encouraging Atlantic applications. In the north, the Hudson's Bay Company operated under royal charter, establishing massive factories on bay shores where ships called annually. York Factory in Fort Albany received immense quantities of beaver pelts paddled down by Cree and the Assiniboine middlemen. Company servants wintered in stone buildings, trading iron goods for prime winter coats. Strict hierarchies govern life factors, surgeons, laborers, each with set rations and duties. Indigenous hunters camped nearby seasonally, exchanging stories around fires while waiting for trade to open. Company's monopoly discouraged smaller competitors, concentrating wealth in London stockholders. Spanish policy in Florida and the Southwest emphasized missions alongside presidios, the trade secondary to religious conversion and defense. Silver from Mexico flowed northward to supply garrisons, purchasing deer skins and horses from local nations. Posts like St. Augustine served as distribution points for European cloth and tools. Appalachia and Timucua communities supplied corn and labor, integrated gradually into the mission economy. Raids by English-backed Creeks disrupted these networks, forcing defensive consolidation. Trade remained limited compared to northern fur volumes, shaped more by strategic needs needs than commercial ambition. Across all powers, mercantilist regulations created quiet tensions. Colonists resented being forced to buy dear English manufacturers while selling raw goods cheaply. Assemblies passed laws encouraging local production, sheep raising in New England, ironworks in Pennsylvania, only to face discouragement from London. Woolen acts prohibited export of colonial hats or cloth beyond local markets. Such restrictions slowed diversification, keeping economies focused on staples. Yet loopholes and lax enforcement allowed gradual growth of intercolonial trade in foodstuffs and lumber. These posts and policies together laid foundations for larger commercial systems. Indigenous partners adapted, becoming skilled negotiators who played European rivals against each other. Women often processed hides or managed camp trade, influencing what reached the posts. Children grew up bilingual, guiding future exchanges. The steady accumulation at forts and warehouses fed growing transatlantic fleets. As night deepens around you, sense the patient persistence of these outposts anchoring trade across vast distances in differing worlds. As trading posts and commodity currencies kept commerce flowing steadily through the colonies, a quieter transformation began in the fields and plantations, where certain crops emerged as pillars of wealth. Tobacco took root first in Virginia and Maryland, its broad leaves thriving in the warm, humid climate along river banks. Planters learned through trial and patience to cure the leaves properly, rolling them into tight hogsheads for shipment across the Atlantic. Demand in England and Europe grew steadily, turning this once curious plant into a reliable source of income. Fields expanded gradually, cleared by hand and tended through long sun-filled days. The crop's success drew more settlers who staked claims along fertile tidal rivers, building modest homes amid the expanding patches of green. Imagine yourself walking along a Virginia river in the late 1600s, the air heavy with the sweet, earthy scent of growing tobacco plants stretching row upon row. Workers moved slowly between the stalks, tapping flowers to encourage leaf growth and picking worms by hand in the morning coolness. Seedlings started in beds were transplanted carefully, each spaced to allow air and sunlight. After harvest, leaves hung in darkened barns to cure, turning golden brown over weeks of watchful tending. Packers pressed the cured tobacco into massive barrels, nailing hoops tight for the long ocean voyage. Ships waited at small wharves, loading cargo that would return as cloth tools and furnishings for the planter's table. Further south, in the Carolina Lowcountry and later Georgia, rice joined tobacco as a staple crop, demanding different rhythms of labor and land. Flooded fields along coastal rivers mirrored the plant's Asian origins, with gates and ditches engineered to control water flow. Seeds broadcast in spring swelled under inches of fresh river water. Then fields drained for weeding and hoeing. Harvest came with sickles in the humid autumn, bundles threshed and winnowed by hand or pounded in mortars. The polished grains filled barrels bound for English tables or Caribbean markets. Planters prospered quietly, their wealth measured in the steady rhythm of annual yields. Sugarcane arrived through Barbados and spread to South Carolina and Louisiana, its tall stalks requiring heavy processing to extract sweet juice. Mills powered by water animals or wind crushed the cane soon after cutting to preserve freshness. Boiling houses worked through the night, clarifying juice into syrup, then crystallizing it into raw sugar. The labor was ceaseless during grinding season, fires tended constantly under copper kettles. Molasses drained off as a byproduct found markets in northern distilleries for rum. Plantations organized around this intensive cycle with fields replanted from cuttings each year. Cotton emerged later in the mid-1700s, its soft bolls picked by hand across upland fields in the Carolinas and Georgia. Short staple varieties with sticky green seeds grew inland where tobacco wearied the soil. Families and small farms managed the crop initially, gathering around porches in autumn evenings to separate seed from fiber. Eli Whitney's gin in 1793 changed this patient work, allowing one person to clean what once took many days. Production rose steadily, feeding English textile mills hungry for raw fiber. enslaved crops spread westward after the Revolution, reshaping landscapes and economies. These cash crops profoundly shaped labor systems across regions. In the Chesapeake, tobacco's seasonal demands first drew indentured servants from England bound for 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage. They cleared land, planted, and harvested alongside owners in small gangs living in simple quarters. As servant numbers declined and crop acreage grew, planters turned increasingly to enslave African laborers purchased through expanding transatlantic networks. Enslaved people worked the fields year-round, their knowledge of rice and cattle herding proving vital in southern colonies. Large plantations developed hierarchical oversight with drivers and overseers managing tasks from dawn to dusk. The shift to enslaved labor brought quiet but lasting changes to colonial society. Plantations became self-contained communities with enslaved artisans, cooks, and midwives supporting the main crop cycle. Children born into bondage ensured a permanent workforce, unlike time-limited servants. Wealth concentrated in fewer hands, creating a planter class that built larger homes and imported luxuries. Smaller farmers persisted, growing food crops alongside tobacco, but the great plantation set the economic tone. Credit from British merchants tied planters to overseas markets, debts paid in future harvests. Rice and indigo in the Low Country demanded even more intensive labor in harsh wetland conditions. Enslaved workers, many from West African rice-growing regions, applied expertise in irrigation and cultivation. The caste system allowed individuals to work assigned plots, finishing early if diligent, providing small incentives within bondage. Malaria and other fevers took a steady toll in the humid summers. Plantations grew isolated, connected by waterways rather than roads. Wealth from rice exports built elegant Charleston townhouses for absentee owners. Sugar plantations, though fewer on the mainland, followed Caribbean patterns of gang labor under strict supervision. The crop's short harvest window left no room for rest, with mills running continuously. Enslaved people faced the most grueling conditions. Mortality rates high enough to require constant imports. Louisiana's later sugar estates combined French and Spanish influences. Levees built to protect cane fields from river floods. Perhaps profitability justified the human cost in the eyes of owners. Cotton's rise after independence accelerated these patterns, spreading slavery inland across the southern frontier. Short seasons of planting and picking bookended long periods of hoeing and weeding. Enslaved families often lived in quarters near fields, tending small gardens for extra food. The domestic slave trade grew, moving people from older states to new cotton lands. Wealth flowed to factors in port cities to advance supplies against future crops. The system embedded itself deeply, shaping laws, politics, and social order. Through all this, cash crops tied colonial fortunes to distant markets and seasons beyond local control. Good harvests brought prosperity and expansion, poor ones dead and restraint. Planters watched the weather and prices with quiet anxiety each year. Enslaved labor underpinned the system, lives measured against the demands of leaf, grain, stalk, and boll. As we linger here among these fields, feel the slow, relentless rhythm that turns soil and sweat into transatlantic wealth. As cash crops took firm root in colonial soil, binding economies to distant markets and intensive labor, a vast circuit of trade emerged across the Atlantic, connecting 3 continents in a relentless cycle. Ships departed New England ports laden with rum distilled from Caribbean molasses, salted fish, and manufactured goods like barrels and tools. They sailed southward along the African coast, where captains exchanged these cargoes for captives gathered by coastal traders. From interior regions, the vessels then crossed the Middle Passage toward the Americas, arriving in West Indian or mainland ports with human cargo destined for plantations. Surviving passengers were sold to planters hungry for labor to expand tobacco, rice, and sugar fields. The same ships loaded raw commodities for the return voyage northward or to Europe, completing the triangle that fueled growing prosperity. In Imagine yourself on a quiet wharf in Boston or Newport in the early 1700s, watching vessels prepare for the long journey westward across the ocean. Distilleries nearby filled the air with the warm scent of fermenting molasses, turning Caribbean sugar byproducts into potent rum stored in oak barrels. Coopers hammered hoops tight while sailmakers mended canvas for the months at sea. Captains consulted charts and logs from previous voyages, calculating provisions for crew and expected trade goods. Families gathered to see off relatives aboard, knowing the circuit might keep them away for a year or more. The ships slipped out on favorable tides, bound first for the African coast where established factories awaited. On the African side, European forts dotted the shoreline from Senegal to Angola. Places like Cape Coast Castle or Elmina where traders maintained warehouses and alliances with local rulers. Rum, cloth, iron bars from colonial ports purchased people captured in conflicts or raids farther inland. African merchants brought groups to the coast in chains, exchanging them for goods that enhanced their own power and trade networks. Fort dungeons held captives temporarily, awaiting ship arrival under grim conditions that claimed many lives even before embarkation. Surgeons examined individuals for signs of health, selecting those deemed fit for the demanding voyage ahead. The human cost accumulated quietly here, far from colonial eyes. Middle Passage itself lasted weeks or months, depending on winds and currents, with ships crowded below decks in ways that prioritized capacity over comfort. Crews rationed water and food carefully, knowing that arrival numbers directly affected profits. Disease spread readily in the confined spaces, claiming lives that represented lost investment to owners. Captains navigated the trade winds, aiming for Caribbean islands first where demand for labor remained constant. Upon landing, survivors faced auctions on dockside platforms separated into lots based on age, strength, and skills. Planters bid steadily, calculating how many new hands would expand next season's output. This circuit's efficiency lay in its closed loop, each leg generating goods needed for the next while producing profits at every stage. New England merchants distilled molasses into rum that fetched high prices in Africa. African trade supplied laborers whose work produced sugar, tobacco, and rice worth far more in European markets. Plantation owners paid for enslaved people with crop receipts, often on credit advanced by the same merchants completing the circle. Shipbuilders, insurers, and outfitters in northern ports shared in the returns, their livelihoods tied to the triangle's steady turn. Wealth accumulated gradually in counting houses, funding larger vessels and more frequent voyages. The human foundation of this wealth cannot be overlooked, as enslaved Africans and their descendants provided the enduring labor that cash crops demanded. Rooted from homelands, they brought agricultural knowledge, rice cultivation techniques, cattle herding, indigo processing that proved essential in new environments. Plantations organized their days around gang or task systems, with overseers ensuring steady progress from sunrise to sunset. Families formed where possible, though sales often separated kin, scattering people across regions. Resistance took quiet forms, slowed work, preserved cultural practices, or occasional flight to remote areas. Lives poured into the soil enriched future harvests, building fortunes for owners and merchants alike. Still, many indigenous nations maintained control over the terms of trade for generations. They chose which European outposts to visit, bringing pelts only when prices in wampum or goods suited them. Seasonal rhythms persisted, with winter trapping followed by spring gatherings at coastal forts. Women often managed the processing of hides, ensuring quality that commanded better returns. Elders counseled caution, reminding younger traders to preserve balance with the animal spirits. The newcomers remained dependent on indigenous knowledge of rivers, forests, and weather for survival. As the 1600s progressed, the volume of furs flowing eastward grew steadily. Beaver populations in accessible areas began to decline from sustained harvesting. Trubbers moved deeper into the interior, extending trade routes westward toward the Great Lakes. French coureurs du Bois paddled alongside Algonquin and Huron partners, sharing risks and rewards. The exchange enriched both sides materially, yet altered the quiet equilibrium that had governed life for centuries. Metal gleamed in the firelight of longhouses, cloth brightened clothing, but the cost accumulated slowly, unseen in each individual transaction. Through all these changes, the initial spirit of barter lingered in quiet moments. A trader pausing to share tobacco with a counterpart across the language divide. Careful weighing of pelts against lengths of cloth on rough scales. The satisfaction of walking away with useful items fairly gained. These small, deliberate acts form the foundation of what would become vast commercial systems. As we rest here in the gentle flow of these early encounters, notice how each exchange carried ripples far beyond the shoreline where it began. As these early barters along rivers and coasts drew more settlers across the ocean, the growing colonial outposts faced a quiet but persistent challenge: the absence of reliable coinage. Gold and silver species minted in Europe rarely made the journey in sufficient quantities, often hoarded by officials or sent back as payment for supplies. Colonists arriving with modest savings found their English shillings and Spanish pieces of 8, quickly spent on necessities. Merchants in London preferred to ship goods rather than money, expecting repayment in tobacco, furs, or other commodities. Daily transactions paying a carpenter, buying bread, or settling debts relied on makeshift arrangements that varied from one settlement to the next. This scarcity shaped a world where value was measured in barrels of corn, pounds of pork, or hogsheads of tobacco rather than gleaming coins. Imagine yourself in a small Virginia plantation house in the mid-1600s, watching as a neighbor settles an account with carefully weighed leaves of cured tobacco. Colony had declared this crop legal tender by law, assigning fixed values based on quality bright, sweet-scented leaves worth more than the darker, coarser ones. Warehouses in Jamestown and later ports served as inspection points, where officials examined each hogshead, trimmed damaged leaves, and issued notes certifying the contents. These tobacco notes circulated like paper money, passed from hand to hand to pay taxes, fines, or wages. Planters stored their harvest in vast barns, waiting for prices to rise before converting it into goods ordered from England. The scent of the dried leaves hung in the air, a constant reminder that wealth here grew from the soil rather than from royal mints. In New England, where rocky soil limited large-scale tobacco cultivation, other commodities filled the gap. Wampum continued to serve as a small change among settlers near indigenous networks. Its strings counted out for minor purchases. Pine tree shillings, minted briefly in Boston under John Hull, provided some coinage, but production halted under English pressure. More commonly, transactions used country pay bushels of wheat, rye, or Indian corn valued at current rates set by town meetings. Barrel of salt pork or a quantity of beaver pelts might discharge a debt to a shopkeeper. Ledgers filled with entries like credited for 10 pounds of butter or debited 3 days' labor, reflecting a patient system of mutual obligation. Ministers and teachers often received salaries in mixed goods, firewood, cloth, or livestock delivered over the year. Maryland followed Virginia's lead, adopting tobacco as currency while also accepting corn and pork in certain transactions. Planters there developed similar inspection laws to maintain quality and prevent fraud. In the Carolinas, rice and indigo later joined the list of accepted tenders, their value fluctuating with harvest yields and overseas demand. Everywhere, the lack of species encouraged creative bookkeeping. Merchants kept accounts in pounds sterling but settled them periodically in local produce. A debtor might pay part in cash, part in cattle, and part in promised future delivery. This flexibility allowed communities to function despite the chronic shortage of metal money. Chaos rose gently but persistently from these arrangements. Prices shifted with each season's harvest. Too much tobacco flooded the market, and its value as currency dropped, leaving planters struggling to pay debts. Poor quality leaves sometimes slipped past inspectors, eroding trust in the system. In Massachusetts, officials periodically adjusted the rated value of grain to reflect scarcity after bad weather. Shopkeepers grumbled when customers paid in bulky barrels rather than convenient coins. Creditors occasionally refused country pay, insisting on specie that few possessed. Courts mediated disputes over whether a certain cow or quantity of boards truly equaled the agreed sum. Yet these solutions also fostered resilience and local interdependence. Farmers produced surpluses knowing they could serve as money, encouraging diversification. Peasants accepted payment in goods they could use or trade onward. Women often managed household accounts, bartering eggs, cheese, or woven cloth at markets. Taverns served as informal clearinghouses where drinkers settled tabs with promises backed by future harvests. The rhythm of rural life accommodated these delays: plant in spring, harvest in fall, settle accounts in winter. No unhurried, credit extended across seasons built quiet networks of trust. In Pennsylvania, William Penn's Quaker colony experimented with its own paper notes backed by land, but these circulated unevenly. Often, transactions used a mix of English coins that trickled in wampum, and commodities like wheat from fertile Delaware Valley farms. German and Scots-Irish settlers brought skills and crafts in farming, adding linen, whiskey, and flour to the circulating mediums. Philadelphia merchants developed sophisticated ledgers tracking complex chains of obligation. Flour miller might accept wheat as payment, grind it, sell the flour for West Indian sugar, and finally settle with a Virginia planter in tobacco notes. This web sustained growth despite the underlying scarcity. English policy complicated matters further by restricting colonial minting and draining specie through trade imbalances. Governors received salaries in sterling, often shipping coins home rather than letting them circulate. Laws required certain taxes paid in coin, forcing colonists to scramble for scarce metal. Smuggling became commonplace, trading directly with Dutch or French vessels to acquire pieces of eight. Pirates occasionally injected Spanish dollars into coastal economies, accepted gratefully despite their origins. The constant outflow created what contemporaries called a dearth of money, prompting complaints in assembly debates and letters home. Children grew up learning these fluid measures of value. Boy might earn a day's wage in cornmeal, a girl trade spun yarn for tea. Market days and town squares buzzed quietly with negotiations. Will you take this beaver hat for that kettle? Agreements sealed with handshakes carried weight equal to any contract. Debts lingered on books for years, forgiven sometimes in hard times or collected patiently when crops succeeded. This patient economy matched the slow pace of colonial life, where distance and weather dictated when goods moved and accounts settled. Even as towns grew, the commodity system persisted. In Charleston, rice barrels served as currency alongside indigo cakes dyed deep blue. Northern ports saw codfish and whale oil join the list. Everywhere, the lack of uniform money encouraged local solutions tailored to what the land produced best. Governors and assemblies tinkered with laws banning export of certain commodities, setting fixed prices, issuing warehouse receipts. None fully resolved the underlying shortage, but together they kept commerce flowing. As evening settles in your mind, feel the gentle weight of these makeshift arrangements, so different from the crisp bills we know today. As these commodity currencies sustained daily life in scattered settlements, colonial powers sought to channel trade through more permanent outposts, places where goods could accumulate steadily under European oversight. Ports and trading houses rose slowly at strategic river confluences and sheltered harbors, built of timber and earth with palisades for protection. French coureurs de bois established posts deep in the interior, like Detroit and Michilimackinac, where canoes arrived laden with furs from distant lakes. English companies erected similar stations along the Hudson and in the Carolina backcountry, offering rum, blankets, and firearms in exchange for deerskins. Dutch merchants at New Amsterdam maintained warehouses filled with European manufactures, drawing indigenous traders year after year. These posts became quiet hubs. The rhythm of seasons dictated arrivals and departures, and relationships formed over repeated visits. Imagine yourself approaching one such post on a crisp autumn morning, the air carrying wood smoke and the faint tang of tan hides. Guards at the gate nod to familiar indigenous parties, who unload bundles of pelts sorted by quality and size. Inside the stockade, a trader weighs each skin carefully on iron scales, recording the tally in a thick ledger. Shelves hold bolts of wool cloth, kettles stacked neatly, and barrels of powder and shot. Negotiations unfold patiently with gestures and a few shared words bridging languages, until both sides agree on terms. Post serves as more than a marketplace. It offers rest, news from afar, and occasional repairs for canoes or tools. Establishing these outposts brought steady challenges. Remote locations meant long supply lines vulnerable to weather and attack, with ships or overland caravans arriving only once or twice a year. Harsh winters froze rivers, delaying trade and straining food stores. Indigenous alliances shifted with diplomacy or conflict, sometimes closing routes overnight. Disease outbreaks in crowded posts thinned both traders and visitors. Competition between European powers sparked raids, French against English Hudson's Bay Company forts or Spanish against English in the southeast. Maintaining neutrality required careful gift-giving and adherence to local protocols. Yet opportunities emerged quietly from these fixed points. Post-centralized exchange, allowing larger volumes of goods to move efficiently toward coastal ports. Resident factors learn indigenous languages and customs, building trust that encouraged steady supply. Missionaries sometimes accompanied traders, opening new areas through converted intermediaries. Forts provided safe storage, protecting valuables from theft or spoilage. Over time, satellite villages grew nearby, blending European and indigenous ways of living and trading. Posts anchored expanding networks, drawing pelts and skins from ever farther interiors. English mercantilism shaped these developments from afar, viewing colonies as sources of raw materials and markets for manufactured goods. Navigation acts required that major commodities, tobacco, sugar, fur ship only to England or other colonies in English vessels. This policy aimed to enrich the mother country while keeping wealth within the empire. Enumerated goods faced duties when re-exported to Europe, funneling profits to London merchants. Colonial assemblies chafed at restrictions on trade with French or Dutch neighbors, who often offered better prices. Smuggling flourished quietly along unguarded coasts, with captains slipping into hidden coves to exchange sugar for European luxuries. French policy followed a similar logic, granting monopolies to companies that built and supplied interior posts. Compagnie des Indes controlled much of the Louisiana trade, licensing coureurs de bois while taxing their returns. Posts like New Orleans grew slowly at the Mississippi's mouth, channeling furs and indigo northward to France. Governors balanced company demands with the need to maintain indigenous alliances. Through generous gifts, rival English traders from Carolina encroached steadily, offering cheaper goods and undercutting French influence. The vast territory stretched resources thin, making every post a fragile link in the chain. As seasons turned, the demand for wampum remained steady. Harvests of shells happened in warmer months, while winter evenings were devoted to drilling and polishing indoors. Trade canoes left coastal villages heavy with finished beads and returned laden with inland products. This rhythm matched the broader cadence of indigenous life, where nothing was rushed and everything followed natural cycles. Abundance came not from endless accumulation, but from maintaining the flow between givers and receivers. Wampum, more than any other item, embodied that patient, balanced approach to prosperity. As wampum flowed along those ancient paths, binding people through shared value and memory, the deeper foundation of indigenous prosperity lay in careful stewardship of the land itself. Resources were not taken endlessly, but managed with an eye toward future seasons and generations. Yet unborn, communities understood the delicate balance of ecosystems, harvesting only what could be replenished while leaving enough for wildlife and neighboring groups. This approach shaped not only daily sustenance, but also the patterns of settlement, migration, and diplomacy across vast regions. Trade flourished because abundance was sustained through restraint, and knowledge passed down through stories and practice. In this way, economic life remained in quiet harmony with the natural world around it. Imagine yourself walking through a mature forest in the northeast. But Haudenosaunee practiced deliberate agriculture alongside hunting and gathering. Fields were cleared by girdling trees and burning underbrush, a method that enriched the soil without exhausting it. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters grew together in mounds, each plant supporting the others in a companion system that needed little weeding. After several years, when fertility declined, field was left fallow and new ground prepared elsewhere. This rotation allowed the land to recover, preventing erosion and maintaining productivity over centuries. Surrounding forests provided game, nuts, and materials harvested selectively so that deer and turkey populations remained steady. Hunting territories were often shared or allocated through agreements between nations. The Haudenosaunee, for instance, maintained beaver-rich wetlands that supplied pelts for both local use and trade. Overhunting in one area would prompt a shift to another, guided by council decisions that considered long-term needs. Scouts reported on animal numbers and rituals gave thanks for each harvest, reinforcing respect for the creatures that sustained them. When populations thinned, restrictions were quietly imposed. No one took more than necessary. This careful management ensured that prime resources remained available for exchange with distant allies, strengthening ties to a reliable supply. In the Great Plains, bison herds dictated a nomadic rhythm that also reflected deep ecological understanding. Nations like the Lakota and Comanche followed seasonal migrations, taking only mature animals and using every part hides for lodges, meat dried for winter, bones for tools. Camps moved frequently to avoid overgrazing the grasses that the herds needed. Sacred sites and camping grounds were left undisturbed, preserving the cycle that fed entire communities. Trade in dried meat and robes flowed outward along river routes, connecting plains people to agricultural villages on the Missouri and beyond. Abundance here came from mobility and restraint, not from claiming permanent dominion over one place. Along the northwest coast, salmon runs provided the cornerstone of wealth for nations such as the Tlingit and Haida. Weirs and traps were built seasonally in rivers, but always with escape gaps that allowed some fish to reach spawning grounds upstream. Elders oversaw the first catch, ensuring that enough returned to reproduce before general harvesting began. Dried and smoked salmon filled storehouses, supporting large populations, and elaborate potlatch ceremonies where wealth was redistributed. Cedar trees, vital for canoes and houses, were felled selectively, only mature ones, leaving younger growth intact. This stewardship created surpluses that traveled far inland in exchange for obsidian, pipestone, and other goods. The Mississippi Valley mound builders managed vast floodplain fields with similar foresight. Raised platforms protected crops from floods, while controlled burns kept woodlands open for deer and nut trees. Fish weirs in rivers and oxbow lakes provided steady protein without depleting stocks. Trade in surplus corn and freshwater pearls reached distant regions, carried along waterways that served as both arteries of commerce and boundaries between territories. Land use reflected kinship networks. Certain river sections belonged to specific clans who maintained them and negotiated access with neighbors. Disputes were rare because everyone understood that overuse harmed all. In the arid Southwest, ancestral Puebloans engineered sophisticated water management to support agriculture and trade. Check dams slowed flash floods, spreading silt across fields, while reservoirs captured runoff from brief rains. Terrace gardens on mesa slopes caught moisture and prevented erosion. Crops like corn and cotton produced surpluses exchanged for turquoise, macaw feathers, and marine shells from far away. Communities relocated periodically as local resources shifted, leaving sites to recover while establishing new ones nearby. This flexible pattern preserved soil fertility and water sources over centuries. Intertribal relations often hinged on shared access to key resources. Neutral hunting grounds in border areas allowed different nations to harvest without conflict. Marriage alliances opened trade routes and resource zones, weaving economic ties into family bonds. And scarcity threatened perhaps from drought or overhunting. Councils met to redistribute access or arrange temporary sharing. Gifts of food or material smoothed tensions, reminding everyone of mutual dependence. War, when it came, was rarely over land itself but over violations of these careful agreements. Seasonal gatherings reinforced both resource management and social order. Places like the pipestone quarries in Minnesota, nations from across the region met under truce to extract the soft red stone for ceremonial pipes. No one claimed exclusive rights. The site belonged to all who respected its sacred nature. Similar arrangements governed salt sources, flint outcrops, and copper deposits around the Great Lakes. These shared places became hubs of exchange where news traveled alongside goods. The rhythm of coming together and dispersing again mirrored the land's own cycles of growth and rest. Even spiritual practices shaped economic decisions. Many nations viewed certain animals or groves as kin, not to be disturbed except in dire need. Taboos protected spawning fish or nesting birds, ensuring future harvests. Dreams and visions sometimes guided where to hunt or plant, adding another layer of guidance beyond observation. This integration of the sacred with the practical created a profound sense of responsibility. Wealth was measured not in hoarded goods, but in the health of the land and the strength of relationships it supported. Through these quiet, deliberate practices, indigenous nations sustained complex economies long before European contact. Trade networks thrived because resources remained reliable year after year. Territories were defined not by rigid borders, but by overlapping use rights negotiated through diplomacy and kinship. Land provided generously when treated as a relative rather than a possession. As we linger here a moment longer, feel the steady patience of this approach settling over you like evening mist. These ancient ways remind us how deeply economy and ecology can intertwine. As the careful balance of indigenous trade and resource management continued across the centuries, faint sails began to appear on the eastern horizon, bringing strangers with goods of iron and cloth. These early encounters unfolded slowly along coastal shores and river mouths where curiosity drew people together for cautious exchange. European fishermen and explorers, arriving in small numbers at first, offered metal kettles, axes, and knives in return for fresh provisions and furs. Indigenous communities, long accustomed to reciprocal trade, approached these meetings with measured interest, weighing the usefulness of the new items against what they already possessed. The exchanges happened quietly on beaches or in shallow bays, the gestures and simple words bridging the gap in language. Over time, these initial barters introduced lasting changes to the rhythms of life on both sides. Imagine yourself standing on a rocky Newfoundland shore in the early 1500s, watching Basque whalers unload iron harpoon heads while Mi'kmaq families bring dried fish and soft pelts. The metal tools cut deeper and lasted longer than stone or bone, making daily tasks like wood cutting or skinning game noticeably easier. In return, Europeans received beaver and seal furs that fetched high prices back home for hats and coats. Both parties walked away satisfied at first, the trade feeling like an extension of familiar reciprocity. Indigenous hunters found they could harvest more pelts with the sharper blades, increasing what they had available for exchange. The newcomers, far from reliable supply lines, depended on these local goods to sustain their voyages. Further south, along the New England coast, English and French vessels repeated similar patterns. Captains traded beads, cloth, and copper pots for corn, venison, and guidance through local waters. Native leaders hosted these visitors in their villages, sharing meals while assessing the strangers' intentions. Metal goods quickly proved their worth in agriculture and hunting, spreading inland along established paths. A single iron axe could fell trees faster than a dozen stone ones, freeing time for other pursuits. Communities that controlled prime coastal meeting points gained advantage, accumulating more of the coveted items to redistribute among kin and allies. Yet even in these early days, subtle shifts in power began to emerge. Diseases carried unknowingly by the Europeans spread rapidly through populations with no prior exposure, thinning villages and disrupting networks. Trade continued amid the sorrow, but with fewer hands to produce traditional goods. European demand for furs grew steadily as fashion in distant cities favored beaver felt hats. Indigenous trappers responded by ranging farther afield, sometimes straining relations with neighboring groups over hunting territories. The newcomers, though few in number, brought items that could not be made locally, creating a quiet dependence that grew season by season. Picture a trading scene on the banks of the St. Lawrence River, where French explorers like Jacques Cartier met Stadacona villagers in 1534. Brightly colored cloth and small bells exchanged hands for fresh game and information about the interior. The villagers marveled at the durability of iron knives, testing their edges carefully. Cartier's men received baskets of maize and tobacco leaves, foods unknown in Europe. Both sides parted amicably, yet the French already envisioned permanent posts to secure steady access to furs. Indigenous hosts, generous by custom, shared without demanding immediate return, trusting the balance would even out over time. As decades passed, Dutch traders established themselves on the Hudson River, building relationships with the Mahican and Munsee peoples. Fort Orange, later Albany, became a quiet hub where wampum and furs moved in large quantities. Dutch cloth, duffel coats, and alcohol entered the exchange, altering preferences and daily habits. Metal tools proliferated, changing how homes were built and fields cleared. Hunters equipped with European firearms could take game from greater distances, shifting traditional practices. The balance tilted gradually as demand for pelts intensified, drawing more indigenous nations into the cycle. In Virginia, the earliest English settlers at Jamestown in 1607 relied heavily on Powhatan generosity. During lean winters, corn and venison traded for copper and glass beads kept the colony alive in its fragile first years. John Smith's expeditions upriver involved careful negotiations, with swords and pistols demonstrated to impress potential trading partners. The Powhatan Confederacy controlled access to interior resources, dictating terms in the beginning. Yet as more settlers arrived, pressure on local food supplies grew, straining the initial goodwill. Trade continued, but now with an undercurrent of competition over land and resources. Along the Carolina coast, similar patterns unfolded with local Cusabo and Guali communities. Spanish explorers from Florida traded iron tools for deerskins and pearls gathered from riverbeds. The metal implements improved agricultural yields, allowing larger harvests to support growing trade. European alcohol, introduced in small quantities, began to appear at gatherings, altering social customs. Indigenous traders adapted quickly, incorporating the new goods into existing networks that stretched inland. Coastal villages prospered as middlemen, redistributing metal items for traditional wealth like shells and feathers. These early exchanges carried profound consequences beyond the immediate swap of goods. Metal tools increased productivity, enabling larger clearings and more intensive hunting. Populations that acquired firearms gained temporary advantages in conflicts with neighbors, reshaping alliances. Alcohol, traded in increasing amounts, sometimes disrupted community harmony when consumed without familiar restraints. Diseases continued their quiet toll, reducing the numbers available to maintain traditional stewardship. The web of reciprocity stretched and thinned under the weight of new desires and pressures. Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the quiet corridors of history. As you settle into the comfort of your bed, allow the soft weight of the blankets to anchor you and let your breath slow to match the unhurried rhythm of the night. Tonight, we will drift together across centuries of exchange, from the ancient trails of indigenous trade to the vast mercantile empires that helped shape a continent. This is not a tale of sudden triumphs or dramatic clashes, but a slow, steady exploration of how people traded, bartered, and built wealth long before modern markets existed. Imagine yourself walking beside them, feeling the earth beneath your feet, hearing the distant calls of traders and sensing the patient accumulation of goods and power. Let these stories wash over you like a calm river, carrying away the tensions of the day, inviting you to relax deeper with every word. We begin far back, before European sails appeared on the horizon. In a time when the land we now call North America was already crisscrossed by sophisticated networks of trade. Long, well-worn paths connected distant nations, carrying goods, ideas, and relationships across hundreds of miles. These were not random trails, but carefully maintained routes, known intimately by the people who traveled them season after season. Rivers serve as broad highways, canoes gliding silently with cargoes of furs, shells, copper, and obsidian. Communities along the way offered hospitality, shared news, and facilitated exchanges that strengthened alliances. This vast web of commerce existed for centuries, perhaps millennia, shaping how people lived, governed themselves, and understood abundance. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a great lake in what is now upstate New York. The water still and reflective under a pale dawn sky. The Haudenosaunee, known to later rivals as the Iroquois Confederacy, had already established a powerful system of trade that reached far beyond their own territories. Five nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, later joined by the Tuscarora, coordinated not only diplomacy, but also economic exchange on a scale that rivaled anything in Europe at the time. Their trails stretched eastward to the Atlantic, westward toward the Great Lakes, and southward along river systems that eventually connected to the Gulf of Mexico. Goods moved steadily along these paths, sleek otter and beaver pelts from the northern forests, finely crafted flint from quarries in the Ohio Valley, and marine shells from distant coasts. These routes were maintained through careful agreements, neutral zones, and shared resting places that ensured safe passage for travelers carrying heavy loads. The Confederacy's Great Council played a quiet but crucial role in keeping these networks open and peaceful. Decisions made around council fires affected trade as much as they affected war and diplomacy. When disputes arose between nations, mediators worked patiently to restore balance, knowing that interrupted trade could weaken everyone. Gifts exchanged at council strings and belts of wampum served as both diplomatic tools and economic guarantees. Travelers carried them as proof of safe conduct, much like a modern passport or letter of credit. This system allowed merchants and diplomats to move freely across vast distances, without constant fear of ambush. In this way, the land itself seemed to breathe with the steady pulse of commerce, seasons dictating which goods moved where and when. Further south and west, other nations maintained equally impressive networks. The Mississippian cultures, centered around great mountain cities like Cahokia near present-day St. Louis, coordinated trade across the Midwest and Southeast from that bustling center. Copper from the Great Lakes, conch shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians flowed in and out in steady streams. Canoes laden with buffalo hides paddled down the Mississippi, while parties carrying exotic feathers and carved stone pipes traveled overland. These exchanges were not merely practical, they carried spiritual and social meaning. A piece of Gulf shell worn by a leader in the Great Lakes signaled alliances and shared beliefs as clearly as it displayed wealth. The entire continent hummed with these quiet, persistent movements of goods and people, long before any European chronicler thought to record them. Even in the arid Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans and their neighbors developed extensive trade links. Turquoise mined in what is now New Mexico traveled northward to the plains and eastward to the Mississippi Valley. In return came parrot feathers from tropical Mexico, cocoa beans, and finely crafted pottery. These items appeared in burials and ceremonial sites hundreds of miles from their origins, evidence of reliable long-distance exchange. Caravans of travelers rested at way stations, sharing water and stories under star-filled skies. Rhythm of these journeys was slow and deliberate, governed by seasons, weather, and the need to maintain good relations with every community along the route. Nothing was hurried. Abundance came from patience and reciprocity rather than conquest. Across the plains, nomadic nations followed the vast bison herds while simultaneously participating in wide-ranging trade. Villages along major rivers served as seasonal gathering points where different groups met to exchange goods and arrange marriages. Here, dried meat and hides from the plains met pipestone from Minnesota quarries and obsidian from the Rocky Mountains. Horses, after their introduction by the Spanish, would later transform this network. But even before that, dogs pulled travois loaded with trade goods across immense distances. The exchange was orderly, governed by customs that ensured fairness and continued access to resources. A successful trader was one who built lasting relationships, not one who accumulated the most in a single season. These indigenous networks demonstrate a profound understanding of geography, ecology, and human nature. Routes followed the easiest terrain, avoided unnecessary risk, and connected resource-rich areas with those that lacked certain materials. Knowledge of these paths was passed down through generations, refined with each journey. Elders could describe distant rivers and mountain passes in detail, guiding younger travelers who carried the next load of goods. In this way, economic life was deeply intertwined with cultural memory and spiritual practice. The land itself was a partner in commerce, offering its bounty in exchange for careful stewardship. As these extensive trade networks pulsed quietly across the land, certain objects carried a deeper significance, serving as both medium of exchange and keeper of stories. Among the Haudenosaunee and neighboring Algonquian-speaking nations, wampum stood at the center of this intricate system. These were small beads meticulously crafted from the shells of quahogs and whelks gathered along the Atlantic coast. Purple beads came from the darker part of the quahog shell, while white ones were shaped from the lighter whelk interiors. Artisans worked patiently, grinding and drilling each bead by hand with stone tools, then polishing them until they gleamed softly. Strings and belts woven from these beads moved along the same trails we have been imagining, carrying value that was both economic and profoundly cultural. Imagine yourself seated in a longhouse during a quiet evening, the fire casting gentle shadows on the walls as an elder unrolls a wide belt of wampum. Patterns of purple and white beads form geometric designs that everyone present understands without a single spoken word. This belt records a treaty between nations, each figure symbolizing an agreement or a shared promise. Other belts commemorate important events, such as the founding of the Confederacy itself or the mourning of a respected leader. The beads are not merely decoration. They hold memory in a world where the written script was unknown. When read aloud by someone trained in their meaning, the belt speaks across generations, ensuring that obligations and histories remain unbroken. Creation of wampum was itself a specialized craft concentrated among coastal communities. Like the Narragansett and Pequot, women often led this patient work, selecting the best shells after storms had washed them ashore. They broke the shells into rough planks, then used pumpkin stems or bone awls to drill tiny holes through the center. Hours of careful grinding against stone followed until each cylinder was smooth and uniform. Finally, the beads were strung on plant fibers or sinew, arranged in patterns that conveyed specific meanings. Coastal producers traded large quantities inland, receiving in return furs, foodstuffs, or other goods that their saltwater environment lacked. This specialization strengthened ties between shore and interior peoples, creating steady, reciprocal flows. In daily exchange, strings of wampum served as a reliable measure of value. A certain length might purchase a quantity of corn, a deerskin, or the services of a skilled artisan. Because the beads were difficult to produce and impossible to counterfeit easily, they held consistent worth across wide regions. Traders carried them in pouches, counting out lengths with deliberate care during negotiations. Unlike perishable goods, wampum did not spoil or wear out quickly, making it ideal for long-distance commerce. Yet its value was never purely material, giving wampum also conveyed respect and good intention. A gift of beads smoothed relations and opened doors that mere words sometimes could not. When European newcomers arrived, they quickly recognized the power of wampum and adopted it for their own trade. Dutch and English merchants on the coast learned to offer metal goods in exchange for beaver pelts priced in wampum strings. This integration shifted production into higher gear, with coastal villages devoting more time to bead making for the growing fur trade. Inland nations found themselves drawn deeper into this new cycle, trading pelts they had once used primarily among themselves. Beads that had long symbolized alliance and memory now also facilitated an expanding market. Even so, indigenous protocols continued to govern much of the exchange, the council still using belts to formalize agreements with the newcomers. The system adapted without losing its essential character. Beyond simple transactions, wampum embodied a philosophy of balance and reciprocity that permeated indigenous economic life. To give wampum was to acknowledge mutual obligation, to receive it was to accept responsibility. Debts recorded in beads carried moral weight as well as material. If a promise was broken, the belt could be returned or cut, signaling the end of friendship. This practice discouraged exploitation and encouraged long-term relationships over short-term gain. In ceremonies, wampum cleansed grief, raised up new leaders, and restored peace after conflict. Its presence brought calm and order to gatherings that might otherwise have grown tense. Picture a diplomatic party arriving at a village after many days of travel along forest paths. The visitors present strings of wampum as they speak, each strand underscoring the sincerity of their words. Hosts accept the gift gravely, knowing it binds them to listen and respond in kind. Later, a reciprocal belt is prepared and carried back on the return journey. Such exchanges happen countless times across the Northeast, knitting nations together in a web of shared meaning. The quiet click of beads being counted or woven became as familiar as birdsong in spring. Through wampum, wealth circulated without hoarding, and memory endured without writing. Even in mourning rituals, wampum played its gentle role. At condolence ceremonies following the death of a sachem, strings were offered to wipe away tears and cover the grave. This act allowed the community to release sorrow and install a new leader with clear minds. The beads absorbed grief, transforming it into renewed unity. Families kept treasured belts passed down from ancestors, occasionally unrolling them to recount the stories embedded in the patterns. Children learned to read these silent records, preparing them to participate fully in the economic and diplomatic life around them. In this way, every bead contributed to continuity across time. Craftsmanship required for fine wampum belts demanded years of practice and deep knowledge. Master weavers could create complex designs that conveyed detailed narratives or legal agreements. Diagonal lines might represent rivers joining, while human figures linked hands to show alliance. Colors carried meaning: too purple for seriousness or war, white for peace and friendship. A single large belt could take months to complete, involving many hands in a communal effort. Finished, it was treated with reverence, stored carefully in deerskin wrappers until needed. Its appearance at a council fire commanded quiet attention from all present.